My father didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. The room was already quiet enough to hear the clock over the fireplace ticking, like a countdown. Sign the transfer, he said calmly, sliding the folder across the table. All $14,600,000 to your sister. I stared at the paper, the names, the numbers, and the certainty in his face. I am not signing, I said. That's when my mother stood up so fast. Her chair scraped the floor. Her hand came out of nowhere. Smack. You don't have a choice, she screamed. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who is part of our community. The room froze after that slap. A collective gasp rippled through the 23 relatives gathered in the lodge, their faces flickering in the dim light of the Ozarks sunset. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just sat there, feeling the metallic taste of shock in my mouth and the mounting heat on my left cheek. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their happiness with my own invisibility. But tonight, the ledger was finally being balanced. I stared at my sister, Olivia. She sat near the center of the oak table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a soft blue blouse that screamed, "Reasonable daughter." She offered me that same tight, victorious smile she'd perfected since we were kids, the look of someone who had already rehearsed the ending of this story. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. Years as a logistics coordinator for the military will do that to you. When things get loud, you get quiet. You look for the documentation. I reached out and slowly pushed the folder back across the polished wood, letting it come to rest exactly in front of my father. I'm not signing, I repeated. My voice was dangerously level. My mother surged forward again, her face flushed red with a narcissistic injury that ran deeper than anger. You ungrateful girl, she hissed, her voice cracking the silence. After everything we have sacrificed to give you a life, you think you can stand in the way of Olivia's stability? I looked at my father, really looked at him. I saw the absolute certainty etched into his expression, the confidence of a man who believed the ground beneath him was solid, because it always had been. He thought authority was a birthright, not a responsibility. He thought my silence over the last decade had been consent. He was wrong. Bradley, the family lawyer, stood slowly and adjusted his glasses. He looked from my mother's raised hand to my face, then back to the trust documents. Ma'am, he said carefully, his voice edged with professional concern. Before any documents are signed, there are some clarifications we need to make. My father rounded on him, his palm slamming the table so hard, the good dishes rattled. This is straightforward, Bradley. Sign the papers so we can move forward. It may not be that simple, Bradley replied. I leaned back in my chair, the sting on my face fading into a dull ache. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the air before a storm. It is not straightforward, I said, because you are asking me to sign away something you do not actually control. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of 27 years of being the other daughter. I looked around the room at the faces that had watched me grow up and decided long ago what role I was allowed to play. You see, in our family, favoritism wasn't some dramatic scandal. It was just the shape of our lives, as permanent as the furniture in this Ozarks lodge. Olivia was 3 years older, which translated to an untouchable rank. She was the first grandchild, the first smile, the first to walk. By the time I arrived, the narrative had already been written, with her name in bold at the top. She was the dependable one with leadership qualities, while I was simply the child expected to manage. When Olivia cried, my mother rushed to her side. When I cried, I was told I was strong. When she struggled, my father intervened. When I struggled, I was reminded of my independence. You will be fine, they would say over and over again, like a blessing that was actually a dismissal. At our family dinners, Olivia sat beside my father, updating him on her high-profile marketing firm and her luxury townhouse in the city. He listened to every word, nodding and offering advice. When I spoke about my life, the conversation would pause politely for a second, before drifting back to Olivia's latest achievement. I learned early on that attention was a currency I simply didn't possess. Most people look at a situation like this and ask why I didn't just leave sooner. They don't understand the invisible chain of the survivor. I was living in a prison without bars, a psychological state of learned helplessness. I had been conditioned to believe that my value was tied to how little I needed, how much I could endure without making a scene. I became the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their peace with my own erasure. While Olivia received a brand new Lexus for her graduation, I was navigating the city with a bus pass and reminders to be grateful for the tuition they paid for a single semester. While they threw money at her designer wardrobe and exclusive social events, I worked 3 jobs to cover my own expenses. I joined the military at 22, but it wasn't out of a sudden surge of patriotism. It was an extraction. I needed a world where precision mattered more than birth order, and where documentation was the only language that carried weight. Basic training stripped me down and rebuilt me into someone who didn't look for approval, but for data. In uniform, being quiet didn't make me invisible anymore, it made me observant. I learned that rules don't exist to control people. They exist to keep chaos from pretending it is order. And tonight, the order they thought they established was about to collapse under the weight of the very precision they spent my life ignoring. The one person in my family who never spoke to me in dismissals was my grandmother, Catherine, the true architect of the wealth everyone else was so eager to carve up. She lived in a modest house on the edge of the lake, a place that smelled like black coffee and the sharp scent of old paper. 18 months ago, she had summoned me during a short leave from the military. She didn't ask for my opinion, and she certainly didn't ask for my gratitude. She simply tapped a stack of leather-bound ledgers on her kitchen table and said, "I want your eyes on these. Not your heart, Vanessa, your eyes." I sat down and applied every bit of my military logistics training to the family books. In the Army, if a manifest doesn't match the cargo, an entire operation stalls. In my family, the manifests were a work of fiction. I began tracking the flow of capital like I was tracking supply lines in a combat zone. Dates, headings, and totals. At first glance, the accounts looked tidy, too tidy. But as I flipped the pages, the cracks began to show. I found line items for emergency structural stabilization and toxic mold remediation at the lodge that had been billed and paid 3 times in just 4 months. Each one was for an amount just below the threshold that required my father's direct oversight. I kept digging. I found miscellaneous administrative costs that ballooned every single year. There were travel reimbursements for site visits that didn't match the lease renewal dates on our rental properties. It wasn't just messy accounting. It was a systematic drainage system. Olivia had been treating the family's charitable foundation like a personal credit card to keep her own failing marketing firm afloat. My compassion for her had been a luxury she'd been overdrafting for years, and the debt was finally coming due. I looked up at Catherine, my pulse steady. "These accounts are being skimmed," I said. $2,300,000 is missing or unaccounted for. Catherine didn't look shocked. She looked resolved. She reached for a thick, charcoal gray folder I hadn't opened yet, the one with the fireproof lining and the heavy metal clasp. "Love doesn't stop people from making selfish decisions," she told me quietly. "It just makes them better at justifying them." Olivia has always taken well to applause, but leadership requires a different kind of character. She pushed the folder toward me. Inside were the recorded trust documents, signed and notarized by independent counsel years earlier. My eyes locked onto the successor authority clause. It didn't list me as a recipient of a gift. It listed me as the acting authority over the entire $14,600,000 estate. I wasn't just a beneficiary. I was the watchdog. Catherine gave me the keys to the kingdom because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't try to burn it down for warmth. "Keep copies," she whispered, "and keep quiet." I did both. I carried that fireproof truth in my bag for over a year, waiting for the moment they would finally try to erase me for good. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until it felt like a physical weight in the room, pressing against the 23 relatives who were still holding their breath. Then, I reached down and pulled my bag onto the table. It wasn't a dramatic slam, just the soft, rhythmic thud of canvas against oak. I unzipped the side pocket and removed the charcoal gray folder Catherine had given me. Click! The sound of the metal clasp was sharp and final, cutting through the room like a gunshot. My father's jaw tightened as I slid the first document onto the table. I didn't offer an opinion. I didn't make a speech. I offered records. I had been trained to believe that, if the paperwork is solid, the words are secondary. Mr. Bradley leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he adjusted his glasses to inspect the county seal and the recording number. My father scoffed, his voice dripping with a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. Vanessa, this is embarrassing. We already have a trust document in that folder. You are just confusing yourself with old files that Catherine probably forgot to update. Bradley didn't look up. He flipped to the signature page, his eyes scanning the witnesses and the notary stamp. Not like this, Gregory, he said quietly. That alone stunned the room. The relatives who had been leaning toward Olivia suddenly sat back. Bradley picked up the top page, his fingers tracing the designation of authority. This was executed 4 years ago. It is a recorded instrument, fully transparent, and very intentionally structured. It creates a successor authority that overrides the managing party's previous standing. Olivia surged forward then, her perfect golden child facade finally shattering. She lunged across the table, her hands grasping for the papers. This is a fake! Vanessa probably forged this using some military software. She is trying to steal my stability because she is jealous. But Bradley caught her wrist mid-air with a firm, professional grip. Do not touch these documents, Olivia, he commanded. The room erupted into a flurry of whispers. My aunt leaned over to my uncle, muttering about how this changed everything. Bradley turned back to my parents, his voice calm but final. Gregory, Stephanie, do you know who really holds the decision-making authority over the $14,600,000 estate? My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My father's face drained of color as he looked at the paper with my name on the line where he expected his own to be. We are the parents, he said weakly. They are family assets. They are not, Bradley replied, looking at me now not as their daughter, but as his client. Vanessa is the acting authority. She always has been. You invited her here to comply with a transfer, but you don't even have the legal mechanism to request it. I looked at my father, seeing the fear in his eyes. For the first time in my life, he understood that the ground beneath him wasn't solid. I wasn't the backup plan anymore. I was the architect. This wasn't a family meeting, it was a professional audit. And they were the ones who had been caught skimming. But I didn't stop there. I reached back into my bag and pulled out the audit trail I'd been constructing for months. Silence isn't just a lack of sound. It is a space where facts can grow heavy. I slid another set of papers toward Olivia. Let us talk about the $2,300,000 missing from the family foundation accounts, I said. My voice was clinical, as cold as a frozen lake in the Ozarks. Olivia's face didn't just go pale, it went hollow. She looked at the line items for those fictitious structural repairs, the travel expenses, and the ghost vendors she'd used to funnel cash into her failing marketing firm. My father looked at her, his eyes begging for a lie that made sense, but the numbers were too loud to ignore. This was the lethal discovery that removed any remaining path to redemption. This is where the illusion of power shattered for them. Most people believe power is something you are born with. But in this family, it was just a subscription they had been paying for, with funds they didn't earn. Their authority was a rental. Now that the wallet was empty, they were finding out that a hollow wallet always leads to a hollow character. Power does not belong to the ones who are admired. It belongs to the ones who keep the records. My mother's hand, the one that had slapped me moments ago, was now clutching the edge of the table so hard, Her knuckles turned white. "Vanessa, please," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "We are family. Think of the reputation. Think of the mercy your grandmother would have wanted." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing but clarity. "My compassion had been a luxury you all overdrafted for years," I said. "This is not a breakdown, it is an accounting." I wasn't just holding a boundary. I was enforcing a permanent lock. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I turned to the lawyer. "Bradley, I want the discretionary accounts frozen immediately," I commanded. "Every credit card associated with the trust is to be canceled by midnight. We will be transitioning to an independent management firm for all properties, including this lodge." The lifestyle they had built on the backs of my grandmother's hard work and my silence was over. No more speeches, no more press releases, just structure. They had spent decades treating me like an afterthought. Now, they were going to learn what it felt like to be a line item that didn't balance. They weren't being ruined. They were simply being reduced to the reality they had actually earned. The lodge went first. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about efficiency. The maintenance costs for a place built on lies were simply too high, and the estate needed to be streamlined. I watched from a distance as my parents moved their remaining belongings into a small 2-bedroom apartment near the highway. It was quiet, functional, and far removed from the social circles they had once dominated, using my grandmother's name. Olivia's luxury townhouse followed within a month. Without the constant cash flow from the foundation to cover her firm's debts, her house of cards simply collapsed. I did not gloat. Gloating is an emotional expense I refuse to authorize. Instead, I took the $2,300,000 I recovered from Olivia's skimming and put it to work. I established the Catherine Legacy Foundation. It wasn't designed for magazine-worthy galas or social climbing. It was built with military precision to provide legal support, counseling, and career transition resources for female veterans. I wanted to help women who, like me, had been trained to be invisible until they were useful. I wanted to support those who knew how to manage chaos, but didn't know how to claim their own space in a world that expected them to stay quiet and comply. For the first time in my life, I wasn't translating my tone to survive a family dinner conversation. I was speaking directly through the actions I took and the lives I helped rebuild. I sat on the deck of my own small cabin on the far side of the lake, away from the shadows of the lodge. I watched the sun dip below the trees, the light turning the water to liquid gold. I was no longer the backup plan, the other one, or the silent investor in someone else's ego. I was the architect of my own peace. The ledger was closed, the accounts were balanced, and for the first time, I was the one holding the pen. Inside my new cabin, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise. The kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I opened the old folder titled Compliance. It was filled with years of tracking Olivia's expenses, my parents' dismissals, and the records of the emotional labor I had performed, just to keep a peace I never actually agreed to. I stared at those lines of data one last time, seeing the ghost of the girl who used to shrink herself just to fit into their shadow. Then, I hit delete. That night, for the first time in my life, I slept through until morning with no guilt, no noise, and no weight on my chest. Revenge was never my goal, accounting was. I simply became the mirror, forcing them to see the reality of the choices they had been making for 27 years. My boundaries were never a betrayal of the family. They were a long overdue defense of my own integrity. The 18 years of raising me that my father claimed were not a debt I had to pay back with my soul. They were the bare minimum required by law. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the backup plan or the invisible one in your own family, I want to speak to you directly. You are not wrong for wanting to be seen. You are not a worthless burden because you have needs that are inconvenient for someone else's ego. For a long time, you might have believed that your silence was the only thing holding your world together, but that is a prison built of other people's expectations. Your clarity is not cruelty. Your boundaries are not betrayal. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop being quiet so that others can be louder. Let the truth speak for itself and move forward into a future where you are the architect, not the afterthought. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you are listening from. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here.